If you want to know, yes, I did get a haircut. I'll just get that out of the way first. It's been like 4 years since I had a legitimate haircut, so that's why I look different. Thank you, Pam, thank you. So recently, I've become sort of enamored of the TV show Shark Tank, which is a show that's now in its 11th season, so I realize that I'm a little bit late on really enjoying this show and coming to like this show. But recently, it's kind of caught my interest. If you haven't seen it, this is a TV show where entrepreneurs go on the show and try to make a pitch for a product or a company, something that they've invented or have begun to work on. And they make this pitch in the hopes that some of these rich investors, known as the sharks, will put money towards what they have invented or what they hope to be able to do. Now, this show actually has benefited a lot of people and a lot of companies that you probably know, you and I know now as just commonplace, everyday companies. Things like Scrub Daddy, which is a sponge with a happy face in it, that I guess is supposed to be different, hard in cold water, soft in hot water. It's got this whole thing. Also, Squatty Potty, that is a product that made its debut on Shark Tank. And actually, even the now incredibly popular doorbell Ring benefited from being on Shark Tank, although when it appeared on Shark Tank, it was being pitched as Doorbot, and none of the investor sharks actually invested in it. They passed on it. But Jamie Sminoff, the founder, still benefited, because after his time on Shark Tank and the publicity that Doorbot got, he won an investment from Richard Branson, who couldn't believe that the sharks had passed on it, and most recently sold Ring to Amazon for $1 billion. $1 billion. And now he's back on Shark Tank occasionally, although now he sits in one of the chairs as one of those investor sharks, as a guest shark alongside the sharks who passed on his invention, Doorbot, which is now Ring. $1 billion. Money is a crazy thing, right? It drives so much in our world, and yet at the same time, it is also responsible for some vast disparities. It creates divisions and dissension and problems. It creates a disparity in our world where the wealthiest people own more than all of the others combined. So money is this crazy, powerful, divisive, sometimes even dangerous thing. And that's the scene into which Jesus steps when we find him this morning in the scripture reading that we heard. He's out preaching and teaching, and he steps right into some of this division and this infighting and this disparity that sometimes is caused by the subject of money. He's out there preaching, and he hears someone from the crowd just yells, "Jesus, tell my brother to split the family inheritance with me." So we can sort of assume there's some kind of family feud been happening here, right? And this guy in the crowd is going to use Jesus as the arbiter for the debate. So he just says, "Jesus, come on, tell my brother he's wrong." And Jesus doesn't actually do that. He doesn't actually get involved in deciding which way this family dispute should go at all. Instead, he issues a broad warning to the whole crowd. He says, "Take care and be on your guard, for life is not lived in the amassing of possessions." And then, in typical Jesus fashion, he goes on to tell them a parable. And he tells them the parable about a rich man who had successful crops and successful storehouses, and then his crops went on to be even more successful. And he had even more yield and a more bountiful harvest. And so the man thinks about what he should do, and what he decides is that he ought to knock down his storehouses that are not big enough to contain his new wealth and build up bigger ones so that he can store even more. And that's what he does. And then just when he's sitting back and feeling pretty good about his decision, he dies. And the parable concludes with God saying to him, "You have made your money, but who will get it now? You have made your money, but who will get it now?" This this is a tough story. This is a tough story because it can feel sort of indicting. Jesus closes by looking at the crowd and saying, "And so it is with those who store up riches for themselves, but do not store up treasures toward God." Jesus isn't mincing words here. Instead, Jesus is directly calling out sort of this system of money and wealth and the disparities that it can cause, and the way that sometimes it can even pull us away from God or a life of faith. This is a tough story. But I think what's interesting here is that the indictment in the story isn't necessarily that the man has storehouses. The indictment in the story is that when he begins to amass more and more, he doesn't look outside of himself. He doesn't look outside of himself to think more broadly about what can be done. He has this desire to just hold on to what is his. I think what Jesus is saying here in this parable is that yes, we can be good stewards, and we are called to dream bold dreams. This man that we meet in the parable, he has storehouses, he has a savings account, essentially, right? He has the things that can provide for what he needs. He gets into trouble when he goes beyond that, and he doesn't think beyond himself. He doesn't dream a bold dream about what he could do with his resources for God's world. Yes, we can be good stewards, and we can dream bold dreams. I think the problem for our man in the parable is that in the end, his bold dream didn't look very much beyond himself. And that doesn't end up feeling like much of a bold dream at all. Maybe our friend in the parable would have fared better if he had known another saying of Jesus that also appears in the Gospel of Luke just a little bit later on. Jesus says to those who are gathered, "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required." From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. This is a line of scripture that I actually grew up hearing a lot around this church, because it was a favorite line of scripture from a former minister named John Wilbur. Some of you know John. John Wilbur was the minister whose vision helped, along with the work of some people here in this room right now, to create Harborlight House, which is now part of our affordable housing ministry, Harborlight Community Partners, and Turtle Creek, which is also now part of that ministry. And John was here when our very first satellite Harborlight Nursery School began. And he was fond of quoting this piece of scripture from Luke as a way of reminding us all that when we are given much, much is required of us. In the bicentennial video that was made in 2001 for the 200th anniversary of the church, many former and current ministers as well as church members are interviewed, and John Wilbur is in that video as well. And we watch it every year in baptism class, so if you want to know why I happen to know this so well, that's why. But if you want to watch it, we have copies. It's a good history lesson. But guess what? Guess what was in John Wilbur's little snippet of interview? That piece of scripture. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. That's a piece of scripture that I think what became woven into the DNA of this church. Because look how it's been lived out. Look how it's been lived out in the broader community. Look at the ministries. It's a yes and kind of scripture. Yes, we are called to be good stewards, and we can dream bold dreams. Yes, we can have what we need to meet our needs, and we can dream what is needed to meet the community's needs. And one of the biggest gifts that comes with being in community is having the gift of each other. Having the gift of each other as we dream those dreams, as we offer our ideas, as we bring our voices together. We get to travel the journey together, dreaming those bold dreams for the future. And what greater gift could there be than that? But sometimes when we walk that journey together, when we're traveling along, when we're trying to figure out what our next bold dream should be, it can also get a little bit tricky. We can get a little mired down in fear or anxiety because we are not ourselves God. We're not Jesus, right? We're mortal beings on a spiritual journey. And so fear and anxiety are part of that journey for us. I wonder if our friend in the parable, maybe he was a little overwhelmed by fear too. Because sometimes we get afraid of the unknown. We get afraid of what we don't know that's coming down the road. We get afraid of what the next need or thing might be. And that's just being human. So maybe that man in the parable, maybe he was afraid. And sometimes we get afraid. And so when we are overwhelmed, when we get afraid or overwhelmed by our fears, the trick is to put them in balance with our hope, with our joy, with our expectation. Because fear and anxiety are not in and of themselves bad emotions. They play a role in our lives. They keep us safe. They keep us out of danger. It's when they begin to take over that we get into trouble, maybe like that man in the parable. But when we put them in balance with our hope and our expectation, then great things can happen. There is a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier, and the poem, I think, speaks to some of this fear and anxiety that we feel on the human journey. Because in the poem, he talks about two different people who long to make a change, to do something different than what their position and station in life would ask of them, to break free of their fear and anxiety. Just like we strive to break free of fear and anxiety in the dreaming of our bold dreams, as individuals and as a community. How do we prevent ourselves from being stuck and overwhelmed like that? Well, in the end, in the poem is called Maud Muller, and in the poem, the two people don't manage to break free. They don't manage to follow their dreams. They stay stuck in what life has asked of them. And the poem concludes with these words: "For all the sad words of tongue and pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." How do we, as mortal beings on a spiritual journey, how do we, as human travelers on the road, how do we, as a gathered community, how do we, as a group of spiritual travelers, a family that we like to call the First Baptist Church in Beverly, how do we continue to move forward to get past the it might have been to the what yet can be? How do we balance the call to be good stewards and to dream bold dreams? How do we move past our fear and couple it with our hope? Well, the good news is, I think Jesus has an answer for us. Because after the parable that he tells, Jesus goes into the second part of the scripture that we heard this morning, and he offers some advice, some assurance. He says to the disciples, work hard. Set your sights on God. Do not be afraid. Strive for God's kingdom of love and peace and justice. And these things, the things that God knows we need, will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. This is a yes and kind of story. It's a yes and kind of calling. Yes, we are called to be good stewards of that which God has entrusted to us. Yes, we are called to be good stewards of our resources. And we are called to be unafraid and bold dreamers. We are called to be unafraid as we assess all that God is calling us to. We are called to be unafraid as we envision that which God yet has in store for us as individuals and as a church family. Yes, Jesus says, you can be a good steward and dream bold dreams. Do not be afraid. Strive for God's kingdom of love and justice. Do God's good work. Build up your treasures in heaven, because that is where your heart will be also. This is a yes and story for a yes and people. I want to leave you with one last piece of poetry as I close. And this is a poem by the great children's poet Shel Silverstein. It's called Listen to the Mustn'ts, Child. It goes like this. Listen to the mustn'ts, child. Listen to the don'ts. Listen to the shouldn'ts, the impossibles, the won'ts. Listen to the never haves. Then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child. Anything can be. Anything can be. May it be so. Amen.